Hello everyone, and welcome to our advanced series of our dry fly presentations. During this lesson, we're going to cover dry fly rig setups, dry fly casting, spotting for large trout dry fly fishing, and a few helpful tips to get you landing trout on a dry fly. Let's dive in. Let's first discuss our dry fly rig setup. As mentioned in earlier presentations, we will at most times be fishing a 2-fly setup with our larger fly on the top and a smaller presentation at the point. As you become more comfortable with casting, we recommend increasing your leader length when dry fly fishing. You might remember that we previously advised on an 8-foot leader with a 3-foot of tippet. Now that you're more advanced, we recommend 12 feet of 4 or 5X monofilament leader with an additional 2 feet of equal diameter tippet at the end. As you start to track down larger trout, these bad boys are truly in tune with their surroundings, and their lateral lines are going to pick up on any sound that is not familiar to them in their environment. And your thicker fly line landing on the water is one of those sounds that will deter them from chasing down your fly. So having the additional leader and tippet will help with the dampening of the noise of the line, but will also give you more reach when it comes to casting to them. Now that we have our initial fly set up, you might be asking, what fly should we use? If you haven't had a chance to review the intermediate lesson number 7, please pause this video now and go and watch that one. In that lesson, we go into detail about which fly combinations to use throughout the year dry fly fishing. In our earlier lessons, we discussed how to track down large trout. We will add a few more things you can do to help spot larger trout in this lesson specific to dry fly fishing. When I'm scouting for large trout, I'll look in the typical areas, but I also look for woody debris, for deep drop-offs where the current slows down, and along the edges of undercut banks. Specifically, I'll be looking for any movement, slow moving shoulders or fins, and especially the very subtle head lifts. The larger trout are not going to be jumping out of the water. They're going to poke their noses out just enough to let the water inhale into their mouths and take the fly. Some of the larger males will have a big wagging tail at the end, and that's a dead giveaway when we're searching the water. Spotting trout is an art. It takes time, but before you cast your first fly, make sure that you're not blind casting. Take a moment to review the water and see where the trout are feeding. As soon as you found a suitable target, take a moment to plan out how you're going to approach that rising fish. And always remember that you should be looking right in front of you before you dive into the water. As you fish, you'll find that some of the biggest fish you could have caught, you accidentally spooked because you were concentrating on fish on the other side of the water versus the one that was right at your feet. The best route to dry fly fishing for rising trout is going to be from behind them so you're in their blind spot. But sometimes you don't have that option and you will need to cast downstream. In this next section, we're going to go over dry fly casting to upstream, to downstream, and casting to cruising trout for optimal success. Dry fly casting upstream. So we've prepped our rig with the 14-foot leader and we have our 2-fly presentation ready for casting. But before we cast, I'm going to take a moment to review the water. As you see here, we have found a pod of rising fish just along the bank, and we're going to target this group. We have walked upstream in their blind spot. This keeps the natural wake of our bodies from disturbing the water surface, which also causes a red flag to prospecting fish. We will get ourselves into a 45-degree upstream cast, as this will keep the fly line out of the viewing angle of the fish the longest, and this will also allow us to extend our drift down through the feeding zone and across river. This 45-degree cast will keep your fly line and leader out of the viewing portal the longest. But before we cast, we're going to want to pull out enough line to reach our target. I like to cast within 30 feet for optimal success. You have to be extremely efficient with line control if you plan on casting out any longer than that. I'm not saying it is impossible, but you'll have more success the closer you can get to the trout. The more line that is on the water, the more significant chance you have of not minnoning or bringing in the excess slack. And when that fish does rise, it's going to be harder to raise that rod and line out of the water to make an efficient hook set. Now, as soon as I have the line out of the rod, I do not cast over the trout, as this will send them down to the bottom. Make your false cast to the side where they're rising, and when you have enough line out, you can send your cast to your target. When you have your distance down, now let's cast 3 to 4 feet above the last spot you noticed to rise. This might sound like overkill, but when a fish comes up to the surface, the water pushes them back as they come up. As soon as they go back down, they're going to swim back to their holding spot before the next rise. If the water is shallower, you can shorten this distance, but a good starting point is 3 to 4 feet. The idea is to make the cast as soft as possible when it hits the water. This takes practice, but an easy way to adjust and learn is to imagine that you're landing the tail end of the loop 2 feet above the water. This will make your cast float to the surface versus pile driving it and making a large splash on the water. The extended leader will also help with this. We also want to make sure that our flies are in a dead drift presentation. This is the no wake zone of fly fishing. We want these flies to be moving at the same pace as the upper water current. A good way of gauging this is to look at the bubbles or other floating debris. If it's moving at the same pace, then you're golden. Now that you've placed your fly in the optimal feeding zone, hold on tight. Keep your eye on your lead fly because that's going to be the easiest to pick up on the water. But the second you see any movement, a swirl, a rise, within a foot of your fly, set that hook. They could be going for one of the two that you sent out there. Most of the time, you'll be catching the trout on the point fly versus the larger indicator fly. What if you don't get a hit on the first cast? Well, then let your fly come down the feeding lane, making sure that you're mending and pointing slack as it comes. As soon as you make the turn, let your fly swing at the end. A lot of trout will be triggered by this movement as a fly coming up as an emerger, and they'll take it on the swing. I typically like to swing it until it gets tight, and then I'd like to do a few hand rolls upstream. I've caught many trout by letting that fly sink under the water and then slowly bringing it back up with a hand retrieve. And if you don't get a take, continue the process. Dry off your fly, cast to your location. After your fly has been soaked a few times, you might need to air dry it out so it sits flat on the surface again. This can be accomplished by doing 3 or 4 false casts to whip off the fly's excess water. We talked earlier about refusals, but this is an excellent time to bring it up again. If a trout comes up to your fly and doesn't take it, it means that you have the right pattern on, but you might not have the right color. Try casting again. If you have the same results, find a different shade of that pattern in your fly box. If you have the same results, try an emerger pattern in that same family. The trout might be feeding on the emerging patterns versus the adult patterns at this time. So once you've mastered the upstream cast, you might ask yourself, what if I see them rising below me, or if I'm casting in front of me off a drip boat? That's when we do the downstream cast. When downstream fly fishing, you're going to want to do the opposite of upstream fly fishing. You're going to want more line out with a good amount of slack so the fly can dead drift into the presentation without disturbing the fish. If your line is too tight when it lands, it's automatically going to create a wake. And this is either going to spook the trout or the trout's not even going to look at your fly in the first place. So how do we cast with slack? It almost sounds counterintuitive. There are several ways that we can give slack in our cast to have the optimal amount of line out to give a beautiful downstream presentation. The first and the easiest to learn is just by stopping your cast a little bit high, and as the loop comes around and the fly is parallel with the water surface, start dropping your line. This action makes your fly land shorter than a full extension of their cast. And as you lower your rod tip down, you're giving more line to the presentation. The second option is to pull out some additional line before you cast and have it down at your feet. When you finish your cast, give the rod tip a few left and right wiggles while holding it loosely with your trigger finger. By doing this, you'll feed line out of the tip of the rod to extend your presentation. I also like to combine the two if I want to extend my drift, or if I've completely messed up my initial cast. I'll start with my cast and then give additional line needed to reach my target zone. So what is your target zone when you're downstream casting? We will want it to land about 12 to 24 inches from the last rise. If you cast 6 to 10 feet above, you'll not have enough slack in the presentation to get it to the feeding zone right before it goes tight. You can always be cautious and start on the perimeter of the feeding zone and then work your way in. Just make sure not to overshoot your target because then you'll have spooked them entirely with your line and your leader. So how do you set the hook on a downstream presentation? The hardest part about downstream dry fly fishing is setting the hook. If you do your typical rod tip to the sky hook set, you're most likely going to be pulling the hook straight out of the fish's mouth. So in downstream fly fishing, you're going to want to have a little more patience. Let them take in the fly and then head to the bottom. Pause in your mind enough to think you've waited just a little too long. And then instead of the typical straight up hook set, hook the fish by swinging the rod downstream, low and parallel to the water. This will help remove the slack from the line using the tension on the water, and it'll help set the hook. Now after the hook is set, you can go to your traditional rod tip high and start bringing in that additional line. Now one thing to also think about if you land that trout of a lifetime is that you're going to have to play some foot racing to catch up with them. It's most likely going to go everywhere you don't want it to, so be ready to head downstream with him if he takes off in that direction. Casting to cruising trout. You'll typically find cruising trout in lakes and deep eddies where they're moving in and out of cover to feeding zones. At times you'll find schools of trout in a particular holding line making their move to feed. Now don't get overexcited when you approach these types of scenarios. Before you take one step to the water to approach these targets, take a good look at the rising trout's feeding routine. Are they feeding in a particular lane, or are they just randomly coming up? Most of the time, they'll be in the holding zone and then move into the feeding zone to rise. Find the feeding zone and then work out a strategy. Do you want to cast at the next rise? Or is the water clear enough that you can spot the largest trout in this pod and time his feeding routine? Now, whatever you decide to do, start by working the outer perimeter. If you throw your fly directly in the thick of things, you might catch one fish, but you're going to spook the rest of them away, and they won't come back feeding for another hour or so. By starting in the outside zone, you can pull multiple fish out of that feeding zone. Now time your cast. If you see the fish coming around the outside of the pool and then rising as it comes to the front, time it for when he's about to be coming to that zone, coming up for that feeding area. Now this is a fascinating yet frustrating type of dry fly fishing, as it comes down to timing and presentation. But with a little luck and a little bit of practice, you can bag that fish. Here are some additional tips for dry fly fishing. Number 1, the hour of power. I've brought this up in previous videos, but it's worth mentioning again here. The hour of power is the first hour of sunlight and the last. At these times, dry fly fishing can be phenomenal. During the warmer months of the year, you'll have hatches at both times of the day. The way the light comes across the water also gives the fly fisher an extra bit of cover from being seen. At this time, the larger trout start moving out of the deeper holes in the shallower waters to feed. This is a fantastic time to dry fly fish. I always have an extra rod rigged up for these 2 times of the day, but also be cautious. You'll have a night when you'll be fishing to the point where you can't see your dry fly anymore. And if you're not prepared for night fishing, this can be a dangerous situation for you and the trout. So play it safe and also remember to protect the fish that we spend all this time hunting. Number 2, different casting techniques. You'll get into situations where you don't have the proper angle to make the perfect cast. This is where you might need to cast with your opposite arm or cast over your shoulder to get the fly into the feeding zone that you want. Take time to practice these types of casts when you're out in the water. Number 3, dry droppers. We'll go into additional techniques in the next lesson, but make sure to always have your nymph patterns with you when you're dry fly fishing. The dry dropper can be a very successful technique throughout the year.